Reach into your drawer and pull out your passport. That small booklet is one of the most powerful documents on Earth. Without it, you cannot board an international flight. You cannot legally cross most borders. You cannot prove to a foreign government that you have any right to exist inside their country. Now imagine a version of America where that booklet simply did not matter, where you could walk onto a ship, sail across an ocean, and step off in another country with no document at all. No photo, no permission, no government even keeping track. That wasn't some ancient era. For most of American history, that was normal. And the system we treat as timeless, the passport, the border check, the stamp, is barely a century old. This is the story of how it began. When the United States was founded, the idea of requiring a passport to travel would have seemed absurd. Passports existed, but they were rare, optional, and mostly ceremonial. A polite letter of introduction from one government to another, asking that the bearer be treated well. They were a courtesy, not a requirement. You did not need one to leave America. You did not need one to come back. And crucially, foreigners did not need one to arrive. For over a century, the American border, as we understand it today, essentially did not exist on paper. Ships arrived at ports like New York, Boston, and New Orleans, carrying thousands of passengers. Most simply walked down the gangplank and into their new lives. There were no lines of officials checking documents, because there were no documents to check. To modern ears, this sounds reckless. How could a country not check who was coming in? But you have to understand what the world actually looked like then. Travel across an ocean was slow, expensive, and dangerous. The journey alone filtered who could come. There were no airplanes, no quick crossings. Reaching America meant weeks at sea in difficult conditions. The distance itself was the border. And America wanted people. It was a vast, underpopulated nation, hungry for labor, to build railroads, work farms, dig mines, and fill growing cities. Immigrants weren't seen as a threat to be documented. They were seen as fuel for a growing country. For much of the 1800s, the official American attitude toward immigration was simple. Come. There was no federal machinery to track individuals, no photographs on file, no centralized records. A person was, in a very real sense, whoever they said they were. But the open door slowly began to narrow. As the 1800s went on, waves of immigration triggered political backlash, and America began passing its first laws restricting who could enter. Certain groups were singled out and barred. Health inspections appeared at ports. Great processing stations were built, the most famous being Ellis Island, which opened in 1892. There, arriving immigrants were checked for disease and questioned before being allowed in. But notice what was still missing. Even at Ellis Island, most arrivals did not carry a passport. They carried a ticket, and the ship's manifest listed their name. Inspectors examined bodies and asked questions. They were not primarily checking government-issued identity documents, because for most of the world, those documents still didn't exist in the form we know. The border was becoming a place, but it was not yet a paperwork checkpoint. That final transformation needed a catastrophe. That catastrophe was the First World War. When war engulfed the globe in 1914, governments suddenly became obsessed with a question they'd never seriously worried about before. Who exactly is crossing my border, and can I trust them? In wartime, an unknown traveler wasn't just a stranger. He might be a spy, a saboteur, an enemy agent slipping across the lines. Almost overnight, nations that had shrugged at travel began demanding documents. They wanted to control who left, so skilled workers and potential soldiers couldn't slip away. They wanted to control who entered, so enemies couldn't get in. The passport, once a courtesy, became a weapon of national security. The United States followed. In 1918, as America was fully engaged in the war, Congress passed a law giving the president power to require passports for entering and leaving the country during wartime. For the first time, the passport wasn't optional. It was the law. Here is the twist at the heart of this story. The 1918 passport requirement was meant to be temporary. It was a wartime measure, justified by the emergency. When the war ended, the logic went, the requirement would simply fade away, like so many wartime rules. It didn't. The war ended in 1918, but the fear didn't. The years after brought revolution abroad, waves of political radicalism, and deep anxiety at home about foreigners and outside influence. In that climate, no politician wanted to be the one who threw the borders back open. The temporary control was quietly extended. Then, in the 1920s, America passed sweeping new immigration laws that set strict quotas on how many people could come from each country. A system of quotas needs a system of documents to enforce it. The passport and the visa became the tools that made the new restrictions possible. The temporary wartime rule had found a permanent peacetime job. And so the machinery kept growing. What began as a single emergency law became a permanent global system. Passports gained photographs, then standardized formats, then decades later, microchips and biometric data. The border transformed from an idea into an infrastructure. Checkpoints, agencies, databases, and stamps. Crossing from one country to another, once as simple as buying a ticket, became an act that required permission, proof, and the approval of two governments. Think about how complete the reversal is. For more than a century, the default was open. You could travel unless something specifically stopped you. Today, the default is closed. You cannot cross unless you can prove you're allowed to. That inversion, from freedom by default to permission by default, is one of the most profound and least discussed changes in modern life. And almost all of it traces back to a wartime measure that was never meant to last. Today, the passport is so woven into life that we can barely imagine travel without it. But it isn't ancient. It's an invention, and a recent one. We call our system normal. History calls it new.